have several things to pass out this evening. Does anybody need Bible study questions for this evening? We've got, okay, let's see here. These are some for this evening. I have something else that, when we have this stage here this evening, my chair was slipping down in the crack between the two halves of the stage, about to disappear from your sight here. I don't know if they did that to keep me from going overtime this evening or what. They had a time, just kind of sink down and disappear behind the desk. Well, what we're passing out in addition to the extra study questions on Exodus 1 through 18, which is what we're covering this evening, I am also passing out a chronology of Israel and Egypt. And certain dates I gave you last time. There's some more that we're going to get into this evening. This will give you a cross-reference. That way you don't get bogged down and lost in a bunch of dates. It also gives you kind of a framework as to the way that things flow. If you're interested in doing further research in terms of the history, the dynasties of Egypt, if you look at your sheet of paper on the right hand, the right half of the paper, there is Egyptian history, the various dynasties of Egypt. The final dynasty 18 of Thebes, which is the bottom portion, about the bottom 1/3 or so of the page, is the dynasty of the Exodus. Now, there is an article, just coincidentally worked out, there is an article in the New Good News magazine dealing with some of this, so it coincides. I didn't realize they were running the article, and they didn't realize I was running the Bible study, but it makes a very nice correlation and goes into some of that. And this will give you something to kind of keep as a point of reference on some of this material. Now, the thing that we had noted last time was that Joseph came to power under the Hyksos rulers of Egypt. This was the dynasty that had been established there in the Delta area, and in the land of Goshen, and in that area of Lower Egypt during the time of the famine and the subsequent time. It's interesting if you note on here the correlation. On the left-hand side of this chronology, it gives you the biblical chronology, just from a biblical standpoint. On the right hand, it gives you the secular chronology. And it's interesting how you note certain things correlating. For instance, the great Hyksos dynasty came to power. Here it describes from the secular standpoint, 1684, which was exactly the time that the 7 years of famine began. And it was during this time that the Hyksos consolidated their power and eventually gained rulership over all of Egypt. Now, Joseph died in 1611, as is shown over here, and within a period of time of let's say, about 50 years after Joseph's death, the Hyksos were overthrown, and they were expelled from Egypt. They were, of course, not native Egyptian. They were expelled from Egypt, and Dynasty 18 of Thebes, which is in Upper Egypt, that's further south. Dynasty 18 was basically an Ethiopian dynasty, a dynasty of Ethiopian origin. came to power in 1567. The interesting thing, one of the common names, if you notice, in the Dynasty 18, one of the things that is unusual about this dynasty is that the common name through the dynasty is Mose. Ahmose was the founder, and you come on down and you have Thutmose, Thutmose the first, and Thutmose the second, and Thutmose the third, Thutmose the fourth. You've got Mose, and Mose. This is the dynasty that would be logical to find Moses, Moshe in Hebrew. This is where we do find him. Dynasty 18 was the dynasty of the oppression. They drove out the Hyksos, overthrew the Hyksos in 1567, and began at that time systematically to oppress the children of Israel, beginning to kind of grind them down over a period of about 40 years to the time that brings us to the birth of Moses, which is when the oppression began to become very serious. Hatshepsut, who is the daughter of Thutmose I, you can look here on the chart, was the Pharaoh's daughter who adopted Moses. She died during the same year that Moses was forced to flee Egypt. Moses, of course, had to flee on a murder charge. Once Hatshepsut was dead and Thutmose III was in full control, Moses was unsafe in Egypt. You know, if you just read the story in Exodus, one of the things that's apparent, something is unusual. The royal rulers of Egypt had power of life and death. A murder charge, life was cheap in Egypt, and the idea of a prince of Egypt being indicted on a murder charge was not a common occurrence. This murder charge was utilized against Moses simply because of the rivalry here that existed between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, who was her stepson, and there was a great deal of rivalry. She had been the regent on the throne until Thutmose III became fully adult and continued as kind of co-ruler. So here was trouble that was stirred up. Once she was dead, she was, of course, the one who had adopted Moses, then Moses was unsafe in Egypt because his stepbrother was in full charge, and there was a great deal of rivalry and animosity. Moses remained away from Egypt for 40 years, from 1483 to 1443. During the time in the area, spending the time in the area of Sinai with Midianites. During this time, Thutmose III died and was succeeded by his son, Amenhotep II, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Let's go on into the material itself. Pick up the story here in Exodus 1. Exodus, of course, picks up the story as Genesis left off with the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. And it enumerates and it mentions in verse 5 all the souls that came out of Joseph, of the loins of Jacob, were 70 souls. Joseph was in Egypt already. We went into the correlation between the figuring last time of various ways that this could be figured. And we find that Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all of that generation. Joseph, of course, died in 1611, about 71 years after the family of Jacob came into Egypt. So the family remained there for 71 years yet during Joseph's lifetime, so there was a great deal of multiplication. Over this period of 71 years, you had in excess of three generations that would have been born during that time. the generation that was born, their children, their grandchildren, and all the way, three entire generations had the opportunity of coming to adulthood and of having children, so that you were already in the fourth generation of children that were born. And the family increased tremendously. They were large families. God blessed them. There were not problems with infant mortality and things of that sort, so the family increased and grew and began to just literally multiply out. And then after the death of Joseph, there was a period of, let's say, about 50 more years, while during which, of course, some of his brothers outlived him and they died, and that generation that had come into Egypt, and then the Hyksos were expelled. Well, in 50 more years, the family had multiplied again, because they were multiplying every generation. Again, large families that would be born, and the whole land of Goshen was there in front of them, and they had multiplied out to where they were, by the time the Hyksos were expelled, they were a sizable community, a very large and sizable community, and there began a matter of systematic oppression, of attempts to impress them into work gangs and things of this sort. There were various restrictive laws that were passed that over a period of about 40, 45 years that began to culminate in, for a short period of time, even an attempt at wiping out the entire nation by destroying the sons, the male children that were born. And so here we come on down. So here we are, and Exodus 1 gives us the account as that there arose in verse 8 a new king who knew not Egypt, or over Egypt, who knew not Joseph, and they began to set taskmasters to afflict them with their burden. It mentions in verse 11 they were conscripted into work gangs, work projects. The Egyptians systematically made the situation worse. Verse 13, they made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, made their lives bitter with hard bondage. Then there was even an attempt in things. You've got here in chapter 1 a consolidation, let's say from verse 8 on down to the end of chapter 1, you've got about a 50-year period of time. The events of about 50 years are summarized from verse 8 on down to the end of chapter 1. So it takes time. You don't go from the situation that Israel had until the total slavery and servitude in a matter of a few weeks or a few months. But a period of 50 years, that would be going back to 1938. A lot has happened since 1938. Some of you remember 1938, and you are very well aware of how much has happened since then. So a lot can happen in 50 years, and things can just literally turn upside down in terms of the established order. Chapter 2 gives us more details in terms of Moses. It gives us a little bit of Moses' genealogy, the family of Levi. Moses, we're told here of Moses' birth and the fact that he was hidden in the rushes of the Nile along the bank. And the daughter of Pharaoh that we can identify from history is Hatshepsut, came down to bathe, saw the child, and adopted this child. And the God had planned for Moses' training. You see the story here of how Moses' sister Miriam, a young girl, was there watching, and when she saw the Pharaoh's daughter pull the little baby out, the sister came up and said, would you like, it shows what even a young child can do. She had a lot of presence of mind, and she was there to watch, and so she kind of popped up and said, would you like for me to go get one of the Hebrew women to be the nursemaid? Of course, in this day and time, as it describes here, they didn't use bottles and formula and things of that sort. There was what was termed a wet nurse that was utilized, and that's something that a lot of us have been familiar with, particularly not that many years ago. If someone was unable to nurse a baby, then it was not uncommon to find someone that could be a wet nurse to the infant. And this is the situation here, that the baby was, of course, an infant, and he was hungry, and picked him up and started crying, and the little girl said, you want me to go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse it? And she said, yes, do that. So what did she do? She went back and got her mother. And now the situation was that her mother was in a position to actually raise Moses during his early life under the protection of Pharaoh's daughter. In effect, is kind of the hired nursemaid, kind of the hired help there in the house to take care of and to run the nursery and to take care of this baby, which of course was her own baby. But you see how God worked things out to make sure that Moses was brought up with a knowledge and an understanding of God's truth. Moses understood who he was, that he was of the Israelites, that he was one of them, and he grew up having been taught on the one hand certain things by his mother, and yet raised up in Pharaoh's court with the benefit of the best education that the world of that time had to offer, raised up and educated as a leader, an administrator, a general, all of the various things that Pharaoh's court had to offer to a prince of Egypt. Now we're told in Hebrews that when Moses came to years, when he became an adult, when the time came, he cast in his lot with the children of Israel rather than with Pharaoh and with the Egyptians. That Moses grew up having been taught by his mother a knowledge of God's truth, and he had to make a decision. There came a point in his life when he had to make a decision. With whom was he going to identify? Was he going to place his loyalty and his allegiance to Egypt or to God and what God was doing with the people of God? So Moses chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. And we're told that in Hebrews 11. So the story we're told in Exodus 2, when this thing came to a head, Moses saw this Egyptian beating an Israelite, and he came up and got involved in it before the fight was over with. He jumped in the middle, and here this Egyptian was killed. Well, the word spread very quickly. And you see the attitude of even his own people. In verse 14, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Are you going to kill us like an Egyptian? And then Moses knew that this thing was known, and he also knew, of course, by this time his stepmother was dead. She was not in a position to protect him. The rivalry and the animosity that was there, that his stepbrother, Thutmose III, who viewed him as a rival, was looking for an excuse to get rid of him. And Moses knew that his life was as good as gone, and he got out of Egypt. He fled from the face of Pharaoh, dwelt in the land of Midian. Now, the Midianites were descendants of Abraham. Midian was the son of Abraham by Keturah, who was the wife that Abraham married after Sarah's death. So the Midianites were basically the same stock of people that the Israelites were. They were descendants of Abraham. And that's why we find in this priest of Midian, with a knowledge of the true God, we don't find him being an idolater. This is not mentioned. So the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and Moses came on the situation, and here were the daughters being taken advantage of. He stepped in and helped them out, wound up marrying one of the daughters, Zipporah. Now it came to pass in the process of time, the king of Egypt died. This was Thutmose III, who reigned for over 50 years, and the situation was continuing to deteriorate. The children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. They cried. Their cry came unto God. God heard. He remembered his covenant. He looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro. Jethro was a title. It meant his excellency. Ruel was you find 2 different names here. Ruel, which means literally the friend of God. The Jethro was a title. It meant his excellency. It was a title of respect. So Moses kept his flock, and in chapter 3 we have the story of the burning bush, where Moses saw the bush burning with fire, and it wouldn't be quenched, and he went up, and God began to speak to him out of the bush. Now Moses used various excuses to try and get out of his calling. In verse 11, Moses' first excuse was, I'm not important enough. See, God told Moses to go to Pharaoh. In verse 10 of chapter 3, said, Come now, therefore, and I'll send you unto Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh? Why me? Who am I that I should do it? And, I can't do this. God said, Look, yes, you can. I will go with you. Then Moses said, next excuse, he said, Well, look, when I come to the children of Israel and tell them the God of your fathers has sent me, and they're going to say, What's his name? And I'm going to say, What am I going to say? I don't even know. And, what should I tell them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. You tell them that I am, the eternal, the ever-living one, has sent you. So, Moses is coming up with excuses. I'm not important enough. I don't even know what your name is. Chapter 4 and verse 1, they won't believe me when I tell them all this. They'll say, no, you're just making it all up. So God went through and gave him instructions about all those miracles. He says, what do you have in your hand? He said, a rod. He said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it says in verse 3 of chapter 4, it became a serpent, and Moses fled from before it. Can't you imagine that scared the daylights out of him? He had this staff in his hand. God said, throw it on the ground. He threw it on the ground. All of a sudden, that thing stuck its head up and started hissing and spitting and kind of coiling around and probably aiming at Moses. And boy, he was about to take off running. He thought, what in the world is going on? And God said, look, now this is the real test of faith. God said, put forth your hand and take it by the tail. I imagine Moses had to think about that one for a little bit. And he caught it by the tail, and it was a rod, just a stick. And God told him, gave him these signs. And then the next thing Moses said, well, look, I just can't do it. I'm not eloquent enough. I'm not a good speaker. Verse 10. I'm just not a speaker. I never could pass a speech in the spokesman's club. I'm just a terrible speaker. I can't do it. And if you notice God was not real pleased with Moses' excuses. When God has a job for you to do, and you start making excuses as to why you can't and why you shouldn't and why somebody else and why me and I don't think I can, God doesn't like that. God told him in verse 11, who made man's mouth? Who made the dumb, the deaf, the seeing, the blind? Have not I the eternal? You go, therefore, and I'll be with your mouth and teach you what to say. And Moses said, well, please, can't you send somebody else? Can't you send the one you ought to send? And the anger of the Eternal was kindled against Moses. God was getting pretty fed up with it. He said, look, I have had all the excuses that I want to hear. You can't speak. Now, Moses, perhaps part of the excuse Moses was using was, look, I've been gone from there 40 years. I have not spoken Egyptian in 40 years. I don't remember it very well. Now, some of you, maybe grew up, sometimes a person grows up with a language and yet they're away from it for many years and haven't spoken it very much. Have had little occasion to use it and would feel very self-conscious about having to suddenly be thrust back into an environment where they were having to speak it all the time. And they'd be reluctant to try. And God said, look, Aaron the Levite, your brother, and I know he can speak. I'll send him with you. Now go. He's coming to meet you. You get there and you better meet him. And you speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I'll be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I'll teach you what to do, and he'll be your spokesman. And you take your rod and you do this. So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and he told him he needed to go back to Egypt, and Jethro told him to go in peace. So he went to do this, took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass and returned to the land of Egypt. And we note here in chapter 4 and verse 24, it came to pass by the way in the end that the Eternal met him and sought to kill him. Now, I think I've commented on that recently in a sermon. The point is here that God waited to see how long this thing would go. Moses, we're told in the book of Numbers, was the meekest man in all the earth. And it's apparent when you read chapter 4 here that Mrs. Moses wasn't the meekest woman in all the earth. And there was, Moses had kind of vacillated and backed down. She had not wanted the children circumcised, had evidently pitched a fit about it, and Moses had given in and allowed her to have her way. Now here God was sending him back as the deliverer of Israel, as his chief representative. God has standards that he expects of his representatives. If you're going to represent God and speak for God, you better uphold God's standards. Now here was someone going back to Egypt, claiming to represent God, coming with God's authority, telling the Israelites what they ought to do, and here he hadn't even exercised that responsibility in his own family to circumcise his own children. The very physical sign of the covenant God had given to Israel. So God waited to see, when is he going to do it? They got all the way up to the border of Egypt. He was ready to cross the border and come on into Egypt, never having done it. Probably having been thinking about it, thinking, well, I ought to, and well, no, I bet she's going to pitch a fit. I don't think I better try. And he just kind of rocked on a wall. And he got right up there on the border, and he spent the night in this inn there at the border, and God struck him down sick to where he just became deathly ill. And God made it apparent, perhaps the thing on circumcision had come up, had even been discussed. Maybe Moses had broached the subject a time or two to Mrs. Moses, and she had gotten pretty irate about it, and he had backed down, because when it came up, they knew what the issue was, and Moses got sick, and it was apparent that God was going to say, look, I've called you to do a job, and you're either going to do it or you're going to die. You've got a choice. That was the choice. You heard of do or die. This was a do or die situation. You either do what I called you to do, the very reason you're drawing breath on this earth is to accomplish this job. Now you either rise to the occasion and do it, or I'm simply going to let you die. I'm not going to put up with this any longer. Interestingly enough, God allowed it to be the situation, Moses to be so seriously ill that Zipporah wound up and had to do the circumcision herself, which probably did wonders for her attitude, because you read that she, when she did it, she cast it by his feet and said, "You're a bloody husband to me." So you know that she was in a wonderful attitude when she finally followed through with all of this. So anyway, the Eternal told Aaron he'd go to the wilderness and meet Moses, and they met. They went through all of the things that had happened, and Moses and Aaron went in and they went before Pharaoh to tell Pharaoh, "Thus says the Eternal, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness." Now, Pharaoh had his approach was, who is the Eternal that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I don't know who he is, and I'm not going to let Israel go. I don't know anything about this God, this Yahweh, this eternal God you're talking about. I don't know anything about him. I don't know him. I'm not acquainted with him, and I'm certainly not going to let Israel go. Well, boy, these were famous last words. I don't know who he is. Before the next year was over, Pharaoh was very well acquainted with who he was. Because God made himself very well known to Pharaoh. Pharaoh didn't have any doubt as to who God was, in the sense that God was the powerful being that was able to this was God introduced himself here. Now, evidently, God's original instruction to Moses, the ultimate plan and purpose that God had in mind was to lead Israel out of Egypt. That is not the first thing that God made plain, or the first thing that Moses told Pharaoh. He was telling him what God instructed him, and originally he told him, "Let our people go a journey into the wilderness to serve God." Now, there are several lessons that we can learn from here, and I'm not going to focus on them over much. Some of it I want to cover in a sermon prior to the days of unleavened bread. But one of the things that you notice as you go through this, that Pharaoh kept offering compromises. At first he refused, and then he offered compromises. The various compromises that he offered, Moses said, "Let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to serve God." And Pharaoh said, "Well, why don't you serve him here? You serve him in Egypt." And then he said, "Well, you go and serve him, but let your kids stay behind." Finally, well, you go and you take your kids, but you let all your animals stay behind. Now, there are some analogies there. You get ready to serve God. The devil doesn't want you to serve God to begin with. But if you're bound and determined that you're going to do it, then he wants you to do it on his terms. At least, don't come out of the world to do it. Okay, if you're going to serve him here. Stay here in Egypt. No, you can't stay in Egypt. You cannot remain a part of this world, this society. You cannot remain in spiritual Egypt and serve God. You've got to come out. All right, if you're going to come out of the world, if you're going to serve God, then at least let me keep your kids. That's the next compromise the devil offers. If you're bound, he doesn't want you to do it, but if you're going to do it, then do it in a compromising way. Stay in Egypt and do it. And if you're not going to do that, at least give him your kids and just go yourself. And if you're not going to do that, well, at least he would like to keep your resources, because he knows that he'd like to keep you enmeshed and tangled up to where you've got so many ties back there that eventually you'll come back to them. The interesting analogies that come through, because what Israel went through in coming out of Egypt is a parallel to the Christian life. And Paul draws those parallels considerably in the New Testament. Now, Pharaoh's original response was, "You guys want to go out and serve God? Look, you got obviously too much time on your hands. because you've been sitting around thinking up things to do. You're not working hard enough. We've been supplying the straw. You're going to have to get out in the fields and get the stubble and make the brick, and I want the quota kept the same. I want these guys to work harder. They got too much time on their hands. What was the result? How did the Israelites view Moses going to Pharaoh on their behalf? Verse 21. They said unto them, the Lord look upon you and judge. You've made our Savior to be a horn in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants. Boy, you have gotten us in trouble. We told you, leave well enough alone. God was getting ready to bring Israel out of the world. Israel really didn't want to come out. Now, they were complaining about the problems. You ever notice we want God to solve our problems, but we want Him to solve them our way? Of course, none of us have ever done that. Beseech God, oh God, please deliver me. But we want Him to deliver us an easy way, a convenient way. Now, God started to deliver Israel from Egypt, but in the process of the delivery, it began to get, the temperature began to get turned up. It began to get kind of hot time in the old town. Things began to get rough. And they didn't like it. They griped and they complained and they murmured every time something happened. They were continually complaining. So their attitude when Moses first went into Pharaoh was, boy, he has really gotten us in trouble now. Well, as we begin to come on through the account, God told Moses that you're going to see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh here in chapter 6. And as we come on down in chapter 7, he says in verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Eternal when I stretch forth my hand upon Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. They're going to know who I am. Now, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. How did God harden Pharaoh's heart? You know what always resulted in Pharaoh's heart being hardened as you go through? Every time God eased up. God would really come down hard, and Pharaoh would finally give in and say, please take the problem away. And when God in His mercy would remove the pressure, Pharaoh immediately said, well, we survived this one. Undoubtedly, that's the worst that he can do, and we're over that hump. Oh, I don't think I'm going to let him go. Now he was ready to tighten down again. He would only give in when the pressure was on. And his heart was hardened every time God eased off the pressure. Pharaoh just bound and determined, no, I'm not going to do it. So we go through the plagues here that God sent upon Israel, or upon Egypt. He sent 10 plagues. The first thing He did was turn the rivers to blood. Now the Nile, Egypt was called the gift of the Nile. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a god. They viewed the Nile River as the life giver. Now, if you look at a map, you'll understand at least part of their reasoning. Basically, Egypt is a desert, except for the area right along the Nile where it was very rich and the soil was fertile, and Egypt is primarily watered not by rain, but by the flooding of the Nile. And the sediment you see as it was coming down river, and it would flood, and the rich delta soil would spread out there, and this was they viewed the Nile River as the giver of life. Well, the Nile wasn't the giver of life; God was the giver of life. So the first thing God did was He turned their God into a giver of death. He turned it into blood. Well, the next thing He did was, they beseeched. He went through the thing, and here, please give us relief. So the next thing He did was, God gave them relief, and no, He's not going to let them go. So here, the next plague God sent was frogs. I mean, frogs everywhere. The one I like the best, you remember the Bible story book Mr. Wolverton did? There's a picture in there, and it's got this picture of Pharaoh holding his cup and this frog hopping up out of the thing. And I like that picture. I think that's powerful. It really illustrates the point. I mean, you have frogs everywhere. You go to bed, turn your cover down, all of a sudden here's frogs hopping out. You get out of bed in the morning, put your foot on the floor, and here's frogs everywhere. Now, the Egyptians worshipped the frog. The frog was the symbol of wisdom. The god of wisdom in Egypt looked like a frog. But the Egyptians, they began to learn that they had all the frogs. God says, you want to worship frogs? I'll give you frogs. You have frogs everywhere. Well, it wasn't long before the Egyptians were killing their gods. They were piling them up in piles and trying to get rid of them. God was showing them that the things they placed trust and confidence in, the things that they looked to and worshiped, were no gods. The next thing was lice. And the Egyptians placed a lot of emphasis. They prided themselves on cleanliness and things of this sort, and they, here these lice came, boy, they were everywhere. And then you had all these swarms of insects that came, and then the cattle died. Now the Egyptians worshiped the cows. You find that actually there's a lot of correlation between the religion of ancient Egypt and the Hindu religion of India. A lot of correlation, particularly when Egypt was ruled by the Ethiopian dynasties, because much of really the origin in terms of many of the things of medicine go back there. The Egyptians really prided themselves on their physicians and their great medical skills, but they weren't able to solve these boils. I mean, here they had boils everywhere. And then the hail came and began to destroy the crops, and the locusts came in and destroyed what the hail didn't destroy. And then the darkness came and blotted out the sun. Now, the chief god of Egypt was the sun god. So here God finally, the ninth plague, He blotted out their god. Everything was black, dark. I mean, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. If you've ever been in that situation, that's a little bit frightening. Ever been in a situation where it is pitch black dark? And so here, God was getting their attention. And, of course, Moses was continuing to go to Pharaoh, and every time that things would let up, Pharaoh would back down. Now, here, finally, the final plague, the 10th plague, was the death of the firstborn. Now, at what point in the plagues did God make a clear-cut division between the Israelites and the Egyptians? Well, in Exodus 8:22, we read that between the third and the fourth plague, God said, I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end that they may know that I am the Eternal in the midst of them. A couple of things to note. One is the fact that God did not completely isolate His people from all of the problems. The first plagues on Egypt, God's people suffered some too. I think we need to understand that as our society goes down the drain, we're not going to be totally insulated from all the problems and all the discomforts. We can be affected as well, but there's going to come a point at which God will make a clear distinction between those who are His people and those who are not. He made a distinction here. In terms of the land, Israel was in an area apart. Now, we come all the way down on through the plagues and on in chapter 9 and chapter 10. in chapter 11, we come to the 10th plague. The Eternal said to Moses, I'll bring one plague more upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, and afterward he will let you go. And this is what God said in verse 4. He says, at midnight I will go into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, which sits on the throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that's behind the mill, and all the firstborn of the beast. There will be a great cry, there will be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt. And the origin of this term Passover in chapter 12 and verse 13, where God told the Israelites, the blood shall be for a token upon the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not come upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. Now God gave Israel instructions when they finally got down to this final plague, the death of the firstborn. God said, I'm going to pass through the land of Egypt, or send the death angel actually, to pass through the land of Egypt. And all the firstborn are going to die. Now what you have to do, if you don't want to die, is you've got to kill a lamb. Every household gets a lamb, and you slaughter the lamb, and you take the blood, and you put the blood on the doorpost. And everyone who is underneath the blood of the lamb, I will pass over. You can be exempted from death, but the only way you can be exempted from death is to be dwelling underneath the blood of the Lamb. And if you're dwelling underneath the blood of the Lamb that night, I will pass over you and will not smite the firstborn dead in your home. Now, God introduces that in chapter 12, that this month, the month Abib, the month of green ears, fresh starts, new beginnings, is to be the beginning of months, the first month of the year. You're to tell the congregation of Israel, in verse 3 of chapter 12, that in the 10th day they're to take to them every man a lamb. And the lamb is to be without blemish, a male of the first year, to keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. The whole assembly is to kill it in the evening, or between the two evenings, to kill it at dusk, that period between sunset and total darkness. Take of the blood, strike it on the side posts and the upper door post of the house. To eat the flesh, roast with fire, and unleavened bread with bitter herbs. It's not to be eaten raw, not to be stewed, but it's to be roast with fire. And everything is to be saved there. The entire animal is to be saved, and you are to eat it. Your loins are girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand. You're to eat it in haste. It is to be eaten in anticipation, with a sense of urgency, because I'm going to pass through the land of Egypt, smite all the Egyptians, man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt. Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Eternal. The plagues destroyed the things the Egyptians worship. You know, the plagues God sent destroyed the things the Egyptians worship. The plagues that we read of in the book of Revelation, the things that God is going to do, God is going to execute vengeance against all the gods of modern Egypt. The things that our nation and our people and our modern society has placed its trust and its confidence in are going to be shown to be no gods. How long is the Passover to be kept? Verse 14, this day shall be unto you for a memorial. You shall keep it a feast to the Eternal throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. An ordinance forever. 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you shall have put away leaven out of your homes. Whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh is to be cut off from Israel. The first day is to be a holy convocation, the seventh day a holy convocation. God goes through and He gives instructions in terms of the observance of this particular festival. And some of this we will comment on in greater detail here in the next few weeks, the sermons prior to Passover. As to why did Israel roast the lamb with the head, the legs, the entrails? The lamb was bled and the entrails were cleaned out, but they were kept there. They were not disposed of. They were kept there in the fire. Well, it was a part of the sacrifice. The animal, in that sense, was kept whole. There was not a bone of it broken. There was symbolism in reference to Christ's sacrifice. It was a whole sacrifice, and there were none of the bones that were broken in terms of the legs cut off or the head cut off or something of that sort. It was roasted over a hot bed of coals, you see, on like a spit, is normally the way that they did that kind of thing. So as we come on down here in verse 28, the children of Israel went away and they did as the Eternal commanded Moses. At midnight, the Eternal smote the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon, the firstborn of the cattle. There was a great cry in Israel, and there was a great cry in Egypt. Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron by night. This would have been in the wee hours of the morning, and requested them. Now, Moses was in an area across the Nile from Memphis, which is where the Pharaoh was, and so Moses had to cross over to Memphis, to the palace of Pharaoh, and then back to where he was. So we're looking at the matter, what transpires here in chapter 12, from the death of the firstborn until the word went out to Egypt, or to the Israelites. We're looking at a period of several hours. Pharaoh didn't get on the phone and call him up. He had to call in his servant. He had to send him. He had to ferry across the river. He had to go to this area south of Ramses called the place that is called there. There is the Arabs maintain the. You can see the location. It's known today in Arabic as Mera Vad Musa, the place of Moses. This is the area where Moses was, and had his headquarters, which was across the Nile, several miles from Memphis. Several miles is not very far if you're hopping in a car and racing across the bridge. If you're on a horse and you have to cross the river on a ferry, kind of a barge, poled across and get on over there, you're looking at some time. And then Moses had to get up and get ready and come on back, go to Pharaoh. Then he had to return. So you're looking at basically the wee hours of the morning were spent in this journey back and forth to Pharaoh's palace and then back. Now, Moses told the Israelites to gather the things that they had. They gathered the Egyptian silver, jewels of silver and gold, raiment. Verse 36 is not in spite of the old joke, it's not the first example of permissive child rearing. It says in the end of verse 36, they spoiled the Egyptians. That's not talking about child rearing. It's talking about the acquisition of all of the much of the wealth of Egypt. They collected back wages for all these the things that they had done. And the children of Israel formed up. They during the daylight portion. Sure, I couldn't get through Bible study without losing my mind. They formed up during the daylight portion. You see, they were told to stay in there all night. They came out, and during the daylight portion, here a period of hours, they were gathering up all this stuff. They were forming up. You're looking at 600,000 families. You know, you just try to notify 600,000 families. Try to get them all lined up and get them all together. You're looking at all day. It was an all-day period, so that it was all day on the 14th after the Passover service that previous evening. See, they spent all day getting organized, getting loaded up, getting ready. Even though they had things packed up, they had to be notified. They had to form up. Their animals were gathered up, and they formed up there at Ramses and journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. This was, we're told in verse 42, it is a night to be much observed unto the Eternal for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Eternal to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations. So this is the night after the Passover. It is a night to be much observed. It's the night that God brought them out. They spent all day lining up, and then they began their journey that evening and journeyed through the night, journeyed from Ramses to Succoth as they began their exodus. Now verse 40 says, the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. It's just kind of stuck in there, and if you just read Exodus, it would be difficult to understand exactly what it's talking about. But if you compare Exodus 12:40 with Galatians 3:16 and 17, we learn that from the covenant that God confirmed with Abraham when he was 99 years old until the Exodus, completed 430 years. If you notice in Exodus 12:40, the word was is in italics. The better way to render it was that the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt completed 430 years. It completed a 430-year period. Now, you don't know it from what unless you read Galatians 3:16 and 17, which says refers to the law, the covenant at Sinai, being 430 years after the covenant with Abraham, the covenant of circumcision. You go back to Genesis, and you find that God made that covenant with Abraham when he was 99. And that the covenant at Sinai was made just a matter of 6 weeks after the Exodus, so it was in the same year of the Exodus. So this 430 years completed the time from the time that God made the covenant with Abraham until he began to deliver Israel from Egypt. Did the Israelites leave Egypt on the same night that they partook of the Passover? Well, notice in 12:22 they were told to stay inside all night. So you take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that's in the basin, strike the lintel, the two side posts with the blood that's in the basin. None of you shall go out at the door of his house until the morning. You know, you don't go out until morning. They were to stay inside all night. We're told in verse 28, the children of Israel went away and did as the Eternal had commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. So we know not only were they told to do it, they actually did it. This is an unusual event. So unusual that it's actually recorded that they did what they were told. One of the only times that ever occurred. But they'd had the fear thrown into them enough at this point that at least for a few days they were willing to follow instructions. You might also compare Numbers 33:3. Numbers 33:3. They departed from Ramses the first month
on the 15th day of the first month, on the morrow after the Passover. The children of Israel went out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. So they left, they departed from Ramses the first month, the 15th day, the day after the Passover. They came out the day after the Passover. We're told in Exodus 12:42 that they came out at night. It is a night to be much observed unto the Eternal for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So we find them coming out in the evening on the 15th, the day after the Passover. So it ought to be pretty apparent when you put all the Scriptures together. The Jews today follow the custom of the Pharisees in the time of Christ. One of the things that's apparent, we'll comment on it in sermons as we get closer to Passover, the Jews of the New Testament period, at least the Pharisees and the Sadducees, observed the Passover a day later than Jesus and his disciples observed it. That's apparent. Jesus observed the Passover the night prior to his crucifixion. The Pharisees had not partaken of the Passover until the night following the crucifixion. The Jews follow their custom, we follow Christ's custom. Since Christ is the one that initiated the Passover, he certainly knew when it ought to be kept and how it ought to be kept. You can find some of the commentaries wanting to quibble about the Hebrew. You have Christ's example, which really settles it as to the fact that when he kept it. And really, if you just take Exodus 12 for what it says, there's not really a problem. So we find in chapter 13 that God said to sanctify all the firstborn. You're to remember this day, verse 3, chapter 13, which you came out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. You're to eat 7 days of unleavened bread, verse 6. You're not to have unleavened bread. You're not to have leavening in all your quarters. God led them on through. We're told here they journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. They took their journey in verse 20 from Succoth to Etham in the edge of the wilderness. Verse 21, the Eternal went before them to lead them in a pillar of a cloud, to lead them by the way, by a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day. So God led them, and He led them, verse 18, through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. The children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt. Now that term harnessed, if you look it up, it means by 5 in a rank. There was not just a great mob scene. God is a God of organization and order. They lined up and marched. They lined up and marched. That's the only efficient way to move a large group of people a long way. It's not just this great mob scene of everybody kind of swarming. They were all lined up. They were, each tribe. They were lined up by tribe and by clan and by family, and they were lined up 5 in a rank, and they went up in an organized fashion. It was an organized presentation as they went out. And they followed where God led. And we find in verse 19 that Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. For he, Joseph, had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones away hence with you. They went from Succoth to Etham and camped in the edge of the wilderness. Then God told Moses, tell them to turn and camp before Pihahiroth, between Migdal and the sea, over against Baal-zephon. And God led them in a way, if you look on a map, you find that God really led them into kind of a box canyon. He led them down in this area as they journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, down to Etham, down to Migdol, and they wound up right over here, camped out to where on the one end, south of them, there were mountains. Kind of south and west, there were mountains. East was the Red Sea, and north was the way they came in. They were led into a bottleneck. It looked impossible. Now, there's a point in that. When you follow where God leads, you leave the driving to Him. God doesn't like backseat drivers, you know. You can't tell that God will do it His own way. And sometimes we don't see where God's going, we don't see how He's going to do it, and why do it this way? Well, if you'd been looking at a map, the one thing you would have been convinced of was that Moses had made a wrong turn. Because it was one of those deals, you can't get there from here. Well, yes, you could. God opened up the Red Sea and brought you across. God did it His way. Now, on down in chapter 14, we have the origin of God's healing covenant that in chapter 15 and verse 26, God told Israel as a part of the national covenant that He made with Israel, He said, if you will diligently hearken unto the voice of the eternal your God, will do that which is right in His sight, will give ear to His commandments, and keep all of His statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you which I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the eternal that heals you. Yahweh Ropika, one of God's names. Now, in chapter 14 and verse 14, we're told the eternal shall fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. So God showed that to the extent that Israel would totally yield to Him, He would solve their problems for them. He would fight their battles for them. He would heal their diseases. He would deliver them. He would protect them. In chapter 14, they went through the Red Sea, and the Egyptians trying to do the same were drowned. Chapter 15 gives the song of Moses, that goes through a song of rejoicing. They were brought through the Red Sea. They went into the wilderness, verse 22 of chapter 15. 3 days' journey, found no water. They came to Marah and could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. And the people murmured, saying, what are we going to drink? Now, one of the things that runs through here over and over again, every time things didn't go to suit them and they didn't see the answer on the horizon, they murmured. They were always griping and complaining. And God healed the waters and used this as a point to tell them as to what He would do. Well, as they continued on, what attitude did the Israelites display every time problems arose? Well, they griped, murmured, and complained. 14:12, when they came up there to the Red Sea and they couldn't figure out how to get us across. How to get across. What did they say in 14:12? Is not this the word that we told you in Egypt? Let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. Oh, you just had to bring us out. Why didn't you just leave us there? Why, now we're going to die in the wilderness. On down a little later, they were running out of water. In 15:24, they said, they murmured against Moses, saying, what are we going to drink? On down in chapter 16, verses 2 and 3. They came into the wilderness, and the whole congregation in chapter 16 and verse 2 murmured against Moses and Aaron, saying, we wish we'd died in the land of Egypt when we sat by the flesh pots. We ate bread to the full. You brought us out here in the wilderness, and now we're going to die of hunger. So they were complaining about nothing to eat. On over in chapter 17 and verse 3, the people were thirsty for water, didn't have anything to drink, and they murmured against Moses, saying, you brought us out here out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst. Every time something happened, they were ready to gripe and blame Moses. So Moses must have longed for the good old days as a shepherd. He didn't have to put up with all that from the sheep. So they continually griped and murmured and complained. Well, they came out of here, and a month after the beginning of the Exodus, chapter 16 and verse 1, God began to give them manna. Now notice in verse 4, the Eternal said, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people will go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or not. And it'll come to pass on the sixth day they will prepare that which they bring in, and it'll be twice as much as they gather daily. Now why was this? Well, because it was the Sabbath. Well, it goes on, and this manna, which is just a Hebrew term that means, what is it? That's what they called it. See, in Hebrew, what's it? What's that? Only in Hebrew, when you said, what's that? You said manna. And so that's what it got named. What's that? It was this white stuff. It was all over the ground. And you could do everything with it. You could bake it. You could fry it. You could shake it. You could boil it. You could pound it. You could eat it raw. You could do just about anything you wanted to with it. And there was one thing about it, though. If you gathered extra any day of the week except Friday, it'd rot. And the next day there wasn't anything. It wasn't 15. But every Sabbath, none came. And if you didn't, you had to gather a double portion on Friday. And you gathered a double portion on Friday, it kept over on Sabbath and worked out real well. Now, what, of course, happened? Time after time is, when God started out, He gave instructions, told Israel what to do. Notice here, this is before Israel ever came to Mount Sinai, before the Ten Commandments were ever given. The Sabbath was, in effect, from the very beginning. God sanctified the seventh day at the time of creation. He's making it very plain to the Israelites by a miracle which day the Sabbath is. And notice here in chapter 16, verses 27 and 28, it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day together, and they found none. And the Eternal said unto Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? God's commandments and His laws were already in existence before Mount Sinai. At the time of Mount Sinai, they were simply written with God's finger on a table of stone, and the people made a covenant saying, yes, we will do everything God says. But the law did not come into existence at Sinai. It already existed. And the question here was, how long are they going to refuse to keep it? So, God conclusively demonstrated to the Israelites which day was the true Sabbath through the miracle of the manna. Exodus 16:23 through 30. What does manna mean? Well, it means, what is it? It was a small, white, and round, similar to coriander seed, tasted like honey wafers. It's described here. You can go through the details of the description. But in chapter 17, we have the Amalekites coming in to fight with Israel, coming in, and notice the attitude of the people in verse 7. They tempted God, saying, is the Eternal among us or not? They tempted God by doubting that God could do and would do what He said. So, here, the Amalekites were defeated. And in chapter 18, we find Moses' father-in-law coming out to meet him. And so these sons, or Moses' children, Moses' family, his father-in-law came there and greeted him. And verse 9, Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Eternal had done Israel. And the suggestion that we find him making was suggestions on the delegation of authority. He gave Moses some suggestions here because verse 13 of Exodus 18, Moses sat down to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from morning to evening. Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did, and he says, what are you doing? He said, well, the people come here and they got all these questions and I'm explaining God's laws. Notice, God's laws were already in existence. And Moses was simply making them known. You're coming here to inquire of God. And I make these decisions and make them know the statutes of God, verse 16, and His laws. I just want to call attention that God's statutes, His laws, His commandments, all of those were in existence before Mount Sinai. All of those laws were in existence before Mount Sinai. They didn't come on the scene at Sinai. They didn't leave the scene at some other point. These things were in existence here prior to Sinai. And Moses' father-in-law said, look, this is going to wear you out. This is not going to work. You're lined up here from daylight to dark, and everybody, you got this humongous line. I mean, it far dwarfs the counseling line on the Sabbath. Here you had 600,000 families, not 80 or 90 families. So here, this tremendous lineup of people, and so Moses' father-in-law said, "Look, why don't you appoint people, captains of 1,000, captains of 100, captains of 50, captains of 10? Set up, delegate it out." And then they come to the captain over them, and it can be brought up the line to the captain of 1,000, and if necessary, brought up to you. And Moses, verse 24, hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law. He chose able men and made them rulers of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. This is the system we've used at the Feast of Tabernacles in Big Sandy for many, many years. Became apparent many, many years ago. As the church grew, and here were hundreds and hundreds of people, and finally even a few thousand beginning to show up there at Big Sandy, and just this giant mob of people. What were we going to do? And Mr. Roy Hammer went to Mr. Herbert Armstrong and made the suggestion. He said, "Why don't we do here what Moses did back in Exodus 18? Why don't we establish captains?" And Mr. Armstrong could see, well, that was a good idea. That was exactly what God did and had inspired Moses to do at the suggestion of his father-in-law. And so Mr. Armstrong followed Mr. Hammer's suggestion. And they established that, and we've utilized that system at the Feast in Big Sandy for all these years. So we see here the setting the stage for the covenant that God was going to make with ancient Israel, which we're going to go into next time. I might comment on a couple of questions that have been raised concerning some of this. Acts 7:25. Speaking of Moses, Acts 7:22, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, was mighty in words and in deeds. When he was a full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. Seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him, avenged him that was oppressed, smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, your brethren, why do you wrong one to another? But they said, Who made you a ruler and a judge? And so Moses fled. Did Moses know before leaving Egypt he was to deliver Israel? Well, evidently that had become apparent. Now, the thing is, Moses must have thought that Moses had come to understand God was going to use him to deliver Israel. But undoubtedly he thought, God's going to use me. God has put me in this position as ruler, as a prince of Egypt, and God has put me in this position to deliver Israel. See, Moses thought he knew how God was going to do it. He's given me this job, given me all this authority, and He's going to use me to help the people. But you know what? The people were unwilling to accept him in that role, and he wound up having to flee for his life. Well, he got to the land of Midian. He must have figured, well, I don't guess God's going to do that. For 40 years he kept sheep. So he had come to a point where, well, maybe, God's not going to do it that way. Evidently, God's not going to use me. And yes, God did use him. But he used him a different way. He did it a totally different way. Have you ever tried to figure out what God was going to do? You ever tried to second guess God? Most of us have. Have you ever been right? Good. Generally not. God may answer our prayers and deliver us, but very, very rarely does he do it the way we anticipate. See, we try and figure out, well, yeah, God's going to do it this way. I can say, he's worked this out, that's the way he's going to do it. No, maybe he's going to do it some totally different way. It's a matter that we have to walk by faith. Moses had to do that. Israel had to do that. There were many lessons. Question, going back to the previous Bible study, Genesis 9:31, not a man in the earth. This is the comment that Lot's daughters made after they had fled and prior to their committing incest with their father when he was intoxicated. In the statement that's quoted in Genesis 19:31, they said, there's not a man in the earth. There's nobody left for us to marry. Did they think that all the earth was destroyed? Evidently they did. From everything they could see, all this whole area, their society, the whole valley there was just burned like an atomic explosion. They jumped to conclusions. They assumed that everything had been destroyed and the two of them and their father were the only ones left. That was not the correct conclusion, but it was the one they jumped to. People sometimes get in problems when they jump to conclusions. Okay. Well, I think we have... these are questions on the remaining portion of Exodus. One of the things that becomes apparent, and hopefully has become apparent to you as we're going through this, kind of picking up speed, this is a survey course, and in order for you to get real benefit out of it, you're going to have to read and study this material ahead of time. That way I can hit the high points. You can read as well as I can, so I don't need to read it verse by verse to you. You can read it. We will comment on it, try to focus in on the key points. If you have questions pertaining to the material, you can send it up. But in this way, over the course of the next several years, we will literally cover every book in the Bible. You will have a chance to go through and to read and to study every book in the Bible over the course of the next 3 to 4 years. And to ask questions about anything you want as we go through it systematically. And if you save these, you will have a number of questions and answers that will focus in on the high points, kind of a survey of the Bible. You'll have several charts and maps that will put together that, if you wish to keep it in that way, it can be a source of material that you can go back and review at later times, and in that sense be a tool to help you in your study of God's Word and your increasing your understanding of this book